Hello and Namaskar. Welcome to another session of BW4HANA Tidbits, where I share some of my knowledge and experience.
My name is Debanshu Mukherjee, and today we are going to discuss streaming process chains in BW4HANA. Streaming process chains have replaced something called RDA of the past, real-time data acquisition. Now the streaming process chain works for both HANA data sources and ODB data sources based on real-time changes, meaning as soon as there is a change in the source, the process chain gets triggered. In this video, let's see what are the prerequisites and the configuration we'll have to do in order for streaming process chains to work. So without any further ado, let's get started. Alright, so now let's discuss the details of streaming process chains. So before we go into the actual configuration, the attributes and the functionality of process chain with streaming, let's first understand what does streaming actually mean. So streaming process chain means it's a process chain which is enabled for real-time delta replication. Meaning as soon as there is a change in the source, the data is changed in the source, the process chain automatically gets triggered. So this is usually used for delta extraction, which basically runs in real-time replication mode if the DTP contained in the process chain is in the streaming mode. So the streaming process chain is basically a flag. It's a property of a process chain. When we create a process chain in BW4HANA Cockpit, which is the new place to create your process chains, RSPC is no longer recommended. Of course, it's available, but the new place where you should create the process chain is the cockpit. And when you create the process chain in the cockpit, you have a feature, a flag which says streaming. And that flag enables the process chain to be a streaming process chain, meaning it can now get triggered based on different events which takes place. And these events are triggered either by the ODP queues, which we call operational delta queues, OD queues, or through the HANA event, the data source, HANA enabled data sources, real-time data sources, which can also trigger the specific event. Or basically the agent which gets triggered or which gets configured when we activate the streaming process chain, and that agent constantly monitors the source. So based upon whether the source is an ODP based data source or a HANA based data source, different configurations gets activated. But the main thing to keep in mind here is you don't schedule the process chain. Process chain automatically gets triggered as soon as there is a change in the source data. So as you can see, you can put a process chain in streaming mode if at least one of its processes can serve as a start condition for the whole process chain. Meaning you have to take care of certain prerequisites. So what are those prerequisites which we have to take care of before a process chain in streaming mode can be activated? What are those prerequisites? Prerequisites number one, the agent or the object, the BW object which can start a process chain in streaming modes can be one of the two. Either it is a DTP or it is a start process. Only these two process chain steps can actually trigger a streaming process chain. Prerequisite number two, a DTP which extracts data changes, delta, from the table or view in the local HANA data source or the local HANA source system, which is based on a schema and a table, can serve as a start condition if it meets the following requirement. Requirement number one, there is no implicit or explicit conversion routine or conversion exit configured for the delta relevant field. When I say delta relevant field, I mean the field which you have configured in the data source configuration to be the delta identification field. For that field, there shouldn't be any explicit or implicit conversion exit configured. There should be no lower security interval, or I should say safety interval configured. So no lower safety interval configured for again the delta relevant field. And the combination of the source column HANA data type and the mapped corresponding ABAP data type in the data source should be as per the table below. So on the left hand side you will see there is a HANA data type. We have decimal, big int, integer, decimal, and we have on the right side the second column is your ABAP data type, which is the data type which you select in the data source. When you create a data source, you basically select the data type, or system automatically does it for you based on the proposal. If you have chosen with proposal when you create the data source, then it will automatically assign the BW related data source. Please remember that HANA data type and BW data types are different. They are compatible, but they are different. And the data type of HANA should match the data type of BW as per this table. So if the delta type you have chosen is numeric pointer, these are all the compatibility data types between HANA data type and ABAP. For example, an integer in the HANA data type field should be mapped to either int4 or should be mapped to decimal x, y, x should be greater than 6 and y should be equal to 0, or integer can be int 8 as well. And finally, integer can be your num_c with the length greater than 6. So if there is an integer for the field for identifying the delta, in HANA the data type is integer, the corresponding ABAP data type should be one of these following. And then if it is the delta type is numeric pointer timestamp or timestamp long or timestamp short, these are the compatibility or compatible data types between HANA and your BW. So you have to make sure that the data type of HANA versus data type in BW of the delta identification field should be as per this particular table matrix. The setting streaming cannot be triggered just means your process chain pulls data from S4HANA. Okay, the setting streaming cannot be triggered. Okay, this particular feature of the data source means that your process chain cannot pull the data. That means it will not be automatically triggered. It can still have a very frequent data pull or basically data extraction via the start process. So basically what I'm talking about is that if you open a data source, so let me log into the Eclipse quickly and I'll show you what I mean. So if you quickly open a data flow, so we'll quickly go to my folder which is in my favorite. So I'll go to zdev and then one of the batches which we went through. We'll quickly open a data flow object, and in the data flow object let me open the CDS view based LSA++ flow which we configured, which we worked with during my training. So in that particular data flow we have the entire LSA++ flow starting from our source system, which is a ODP CDS, which is a CDS view based extractor. Then this is the data source, and if you double click and open the data source, you will see that there are certain properties of the data source. And if you go to the extraction tab, you will see there is something called streaming. Streaming can be triggered by the data source. So definitely this is one of the another prerequisite which your data source should meet. So first prerequisite, as we discussed, is that a DTP which is delta enabled and which will be responsible to trigger your process chains should have these three conditions met. And then the second prerequisite is that the data source on which the DTP is based on should have this property streaming can be triggered enabled. These are the two basic prerequisites for the streaming process chain to work. And even if you have streaming cannot be triggered, that's what I was referring to here. If the property streaming cannot be triggered is selected in the data source, that means that your process chain will not be able to trigger itself, or the process chain will not be triggered automatically. Instead, what will happen is in the start process you can configure it to load data every minute. That's the lowest you can go in the start process in terms of time granularity, and every minute your process chain start process will keep checking and asking the source, is there any change, and if there is a change then it will be pulled. So basically the process chain start process is scheduled. So in this case your process chain is scheduled. But if the data source has the property streaming can be triggered, you don't need to schedule your process chain. It will be automatically scheduled. You just have to keep the start process in the immediate start mode and then schedule your process chain. That's all. And it will be automatically triggered as soon as there is a change in the data source. So as I mentioned, there can be two different methods of data transfer. Either your DTP can trigger your process chain, or your start process in the process chain can trigger your process. Both supports pull mechanism and push mechanism. It's a pull mechanism when there is a DTP on a real-time SAP HANA data source. When I say real-time, I am referring to the streaming property supported or not. So if streaming process is supported, this data source is called real-time data source. So if it's a HANA-based data source, then the property of streaming should be there. So that's what it is referring to, DTP on a real-time, meaning streaming HANA data source. Or if it's DTP based on an ODP source, then also that property streaming can be triggered, should be supported. So in both cases, you can have DTPs. One case will be a pull mechanism and one case will be a push mechanism. When I say push mechanism, meaning that the daemon, the ODQ daemon, will monitor the data source queue, will get the data in the ODQ tables, which is ODQ data underscore C, ODQ data, and ODQ data underscore F. These are the three tables of ODQ mon, as we know, and then it will send the event to the DTP, and DTP will in turn trigger the process chain. That's how it works. And if it's an ODP based on not ODP, if it's a HANA data source, then HANA data source will have a pull mechanism, meaning the HANA data source DTP will keep checking if there is a change in the data source, and then it will pull it. So it can support both pull and push. And then the second process which can trigger the streaming process chain is start. So that means you have to schedule in this case, right? But it is supported for pull and push both. So what are the processes which are allowed in a streaming process chain? You can have a DTP, you can have a start process, you can have a ADSO activation, you can have an ABAP program, you can have a decision step, and you can have the connectors which are AND or XOR. Okay, these are the processes you can have. If you have any other processes like cleanup of ADSO or any other process apart from these, then the streaming cannot be activated. This is the limitation. So you only have to have either a TTP or an ADSO activation, ABAP program, decision, or your connectors. Processes that are not allowed are all other processes, for example, deletion and other housekeeping tasks, and a cleanup of ADSO, so on and so forth. ADSO, which is the source for another target for initialization or full, what will happen if the streaming is activated for that? So if you use an ADSO whose activation process is already running in streaming mode, for example, okay, and that ADSO is used as a source for another ADSO, okay, and this is connected via a DTP for delta initialization or full extraction process, then the activation in the source ADSO on which the streaming is activated pauses until the extraction to the further ADSO, the second ADSO, is completed. Only then the activation is performed. Why? Because when you activate, the request ID details are lost, and delta is always based on new request ID. So if the request ID is not there, then delta cannot be identified. So that's why when there is a DTP between an ADSO and another ADSO, and that ADSO activation is configured, then that activation waits until the request is sent to the further target, and then activation resumes. What if another process chain starts and the first one did not complete? What will happen in that case? So that has three different possibilities. The first possibility is that process chain is executed in background mode. Second is process chain is executed in streaming mode. So both are possible. In our case, we are focusing on the streaming mode. So let's see what happens in the streaming mode. If the process chain is executed in streaming mode, there is a flexible number of worker jobs. That means the SM37 background worker job that get the next process from a queue. So this is where a queue concept comes into picture, and this is only for streaming process chain. So there is a queue there, and if the first process is not complete and the second, third, or further execution reaches that process which is not complete, then that request is sent to the queue. Okay, it is written to the queue. No more resources are used, and the system does not wait. It does not wait, guys. Okay, for the first process to complete, it just writes the request in the queue that it has to start. As soon as the first process is finished, the worker job gets all these start requests for a given process and starts the process just once. So that means if the first process is running and second, third, fourth, three other processes came, and it also came to that particular step in the process chain for which the execution is still running, then it writes those 3 requests in the queue and then stops. And then when the first process completes, then only once it will be triggered, because all the 3 are asking for the same process. So it will not trigger 3 times. It will just trigger once. So please remember that. Run modes. So there is something called run modes. So there are 3 different run modes for a streaming process chain. First is normal execution. That means the moment you start the process chain, or I should say schedule a process chain in streaming mode, it runs first outside the streaming mode, just to make sure that if there are any initializations which needs to be done, DTP needs to run for the first time, the delta pointers needs to be set, all that processes, all the steps are executed once, so that if any delta initializations or any other initialization or first execution has to be done, it is done in the normal execution. This is outside of streaming process. Second execution is called first execution. Okay, that's an ironical name, but yes, it's called the first execution, which is after the normal execution is done, then the process chain is actually started in streaming mode. That means events will be triggered, and then events will be configured properly between the source and the process chain, so that as soon as there's a change in the source, the process chain triggers. So all that event configuration happens in the first execution, which is actually the second run of the process chain. And then final run happens just to make sure that the different deltas, if you need to have the delta, you need to make sure that no other process chain is in the streaming mode with the same step, so there are no conflict between the 2 streaming process chains if you have multiple streaming process chains. So all that final check is done in the last execution. So what I mean to say is that when you will activate and schedule a process chain with streaming property, it will run 3 or 4 times. Okay, and 3 times definitely it will run. It might run one more extra run, sometimes I have seen, but minimum 3 times it will run. So don't get alarmed by seeing that, oh, why did it trigger 3 times? And the reason is it triggers 3 times because first is normal execution, second is the first execution, and then the last execution. So this is just giving me a screenshot that the moment I actually started the streaming process chain, started mean in the sense activated and scheduled. So as soon as you schedule a streaming process chain, it will automatically trigger 3 times. So it triggered one at 11:35:07, then 11:35:18, and then 11:35:18 again. So these runs are basically the normal execution, the first execution, and the last execution, and then it is ready for streaming. Monitoring, how do you do monitoring? So basically monitoring is also done on the cockpit side, and there is something called percentage recent percentage that shows the recent run for all the process types, meaning your DTP, if there's a step, then that will have a recent, then your ADSO activation, that will have the recent. So it will show always the last and recent execution or the status of your steps. There are some tables you have to keep in mind. So in BW side, we have RSPC stream check, where it is relevant for HANA data source. So if you have a HANA data source and the DTP is basically the agent which will trigger your process chain, then you can find that in the table RSPC stream check. You will have the DTP name. You can put the DTP name there, and you will see that there is a R_check. This is the pointer or the event or the agent, you can say, which is constantly monitoring your source, and as soon as there is a change, it pulls the data. So we have start condition D and E here. D stands for pull, E stands for push. And then for the ODP related data sources, in the S4 HANA you have something called ODQ daemon, where you can check whether the daemon is activated or not, because it is via daemon these events are basically triggered, and daemon informs the BW process chain that there is a change, and the change has already been brought in the ODQ tables, and the DTP, which is a BW process chain DTP, takes the data from that table. So you can check that daemon is activated or not in S4 site, so you can do that in ODQ daemon table. And then once your process chain is triggered in the streaming, and we have seen that it will run 3 times, after the third execution you can see that there will be entry for ODQ data C table, which is initialization, and then the delta will be ODQ data, and for the delta record here in the ODQ mon, you will see that in the composite request status, you will see extraction running, there will be a gear icon, and then real-time mode will be checked, which means object is in real-time mode. These two icons are your confirmation that your changes are running in streaming mode. Your process chain is there, is listening or polling in streaming mode. So if you don't have this gear icon, if you don't have the real-time icon checked, that means your queue is not in real-time mode, meaning streaming is not activated. Only if you have these two icons, you can be sure that your streaming process chain is properly configured and it is listening to the changes which is happening in the source. And this will be for the delta, not for the initialization. Then you also have to make sure that you have your daemon job active. So in S4HANA or ECC, wherever your ODP is enabled, you will see that in SM37, if you give the job name ODQ underscore daemon and then star, you will see that there will be a job which will either be active or inactive. You have to make sure that these jobs are active. So it should be in release status, and then one will be inactive, and then you will see the completed or finished instances as finished. So those are the prerequisites in the source side if it is an ODP enabled streaming. And then once you have the streaming process chains activated and scheduled and everything is set up properly, you should see the schedule status of the streaming process chain as polling when it is a HANA based data source, and when it is an ODP based data source, the schedule status will be listening. So please remember this is very important. For HANA based data source it will be polling, and for the ODP based data source it will be listening. For HANA based data source, you will see that it will have this particular default check enabled as soon as the streaming process chain is scheduled, and it will say that check regularly, maximum 60 seconds. That means very frequently it will check the source, that whether there is a change or not, and maximum it takes 60 seconds, that means every 1 minute, but it happens before 1 minute, but maximum is every 60 seconds. And then this is for the ODP. For ODP you will have execute if the event is received. This is the event from the ODQ daemon. So this is the difference between when you will configure the process chain for HANA data source versus when you will configure the process chain for your ODP data source. So for HANA it will be schedule status polling, and then the configuration will say default check regularly, max 60 seconds, and then for the ODP it will be schedule status listening, and then it will be event connected or event based, the ODQ daemon event. So that's how the streaming process chains are configured, that's how it will look like, that's how you have to monitor it, and those are the prerequisites. There are certain prerequisites which we discussed should be met if you want the streaming process chains to work properly. Now I know all this in theory looks really good, but if you really want to see this in action, if you really want to see the actual hands-on configuration of streaming process chain, actual change happening, and then how that change triggers the process chain, if you want to see all that happening in the system, we cover this end-to-end in my BW4HANA training. So please enroll in my training where we will do complete hands-on on streaming process chain and all other aspects of BW4HANA, where you will actually see things in system in action. Thank you very much for listening. I hope this clarified few things about the streaming process chain, and this has replaced, by the way, the RDA of the past, real-time data acquisition. So now RDA is no longer there, we have streaming process chain. Thank you, and I will see you in the next one.